Well, church, this morning it's an honor and a privilege to welcome up our guest preacher this morning, our youth director, Ren Stearns, who is going to share our message with us. Give Ren a warm welcome today.
Good morning. You know, Zach always comments on how the kids are a tough act to follow, but I'm so grateful for them for warming you all up. They get you all loose, you're laughing. I can trust you to laugh at all of my jokes so I don't feel weird about myself up here. Random question for you all. Do we have anyone in here who had to learn English as a second language? Oh, one back there? I have so much admiration for you. English seems like the worst language to have to learn if you don't speak it natively. English is my first and only language, but ever since I took a little bit of Spanish in high school and college, something I like to do for fun is think about which words would be the hardest to teach someone learning English as a second language. Because as there is in any language, certain words can be hard either because they're too nuanced or they're too versatile, or sometimes somehow both. We drive in a parkway, but we park in a driveway. Your feet smell, but your nose runs, and I can say, here, clip that, and it can mean completely opposite things depending on whether I'm handing you a paper clip or a pair of scissors. And the funny part is it sounds so natural to us as native English speakers that a lot of times we can't even articulate the rationale behind it. We've just become so used to hearing it that we've just accepted it. But one of the words that I think could be particularly difficult for some people is actually the verb to see. If asked to explain this word, we'd say, well, it's to sense something using your eyesight. But then we also have these other words, for example, we have look. And they're generally not interchangeable, but the rules are kind of not the rules sometimes. An English teacher will maybe tell you, well, to see is to perceive something passively, whereas to look is to look at something intentionally. But then what do we say when we want to look at something closer and somebody is in our way? Let me see. And that rule goes out the window. And then there's also watch, which you need to be careful. You really need to know the nuances between see and watch, because if somebody asks you, do you want to watch a movie, it means the movie is at home. But if they say, do you want to see a movie, it suddenly means we're going somewhere much more expensive. And then the rules about which tenses are okay to use for see are absolutely tyrannical. You can ask somebody else, are you seeing this? But then when they respond, they have to say, yes, I do see it, not yes, I am seeing it. And see also means to meet. And this version is no less complicated. If you say, we saw each other, it means you ran into each other at the store. But we're seeing each other, this escalates very quickly, suddenly you're dating. But the definition of see we're particularly interested in for this sermon is one that you don't actually have to have good eyesight for. Because to see, as the kids were talking about, also means to understand. To truly see someone is to see the world through their eyes instead of your own. To lay aside our own assumptions so we can replace them with understanding about their thoughts and their experiences, why they think what they think, and feel what they feel. It's something we're called to do as Christians. And fortunately, it's also something God models for us. In Genesis 16, we meet one of the most unseen individuals in the Hebrew Bible, both in the context of the story and in the context of modern interpretation, as I experienced growing up. Hagar is an Egyptian slave woman owned by Sarai. God makes a promise to Abram that he will be the father of many nations, but his wife Sarai is barren. And since God hadn't necessarily stated that this promise would be fulfilled through Sarai, she does what was culturally expected of women at the time who couldn't have children, and offers up her slave girl to Abram to take as his second wife. So Abram does. And when Hagar becomes pregnant, She loses respect for Sarai. Upset at the situation, Sarai goes to Abram and expresses her frustration. And although Abram now has 2 wives, he continues to act as though his only obligation is to Sarai and tells her to deal with Hagar however she sees fit. So Sarai treats Hagar harshly, and Hagar runs away towards Shur, which was on the border of Egypt. When I was growing up, so often when I would hear this story, Hagar would kind of get brushed to the side because she wasn't supposed to be caught up in the middle of it in the first place, and I don't necessarily disagree with that part. But the focus was always on Sarai and Abram's hastiness, solely in the light of their dynamic with God, instead of how it all affected Hagar. God's covenant with Abraham is fulfilled through Sarah's son Isaac, not Hagar's son Ishmael. So in some interpretations, Hagar effectively becomes nothing but a plot device, a mere symbol of what happens when we try to take matters into our own hands instead of leaning on God's promises. And while it's true that Abram and Sarai didn't recognize that they were committing a deep injustice against Hagar, because using slaves as a solution to infertility was the cultural norm, it doesn't lessen Hagar's pain. Slaves are property. So Hagar doesn't get to say yes or no to marrying Abram. She has to do it because her mistress said so. And I've seen her contempt towards Sarai interpreted as evidence of maybe having loose morals, because when she flees, God tells her to go back. But what I see in Hagar's actions is what my generation likes to call malicious compliance. She goes, "All right, Sarai, you did this, you made this decision, you forced me into marrying your husband so I could carry his baby. Guess what? Wives are equal. I don't got to listen to you anymore." But then when Sarai goes to Abram about it, he doesn't treat Hagar as a wife. He tells Sarai, "Look, this whole marrying your slave thing changes nothing. She's still your slave." And in doing so, he reduces her to a surrogate. She is nothing but a female body to him. And he's using that body, but he doesn't lift a finger to protect it. So Sarai abuses her, and Hagar says, "I can't do this anymore." And she runs away. What happens next can be perplexing at first. The Lord's messenger meets Hagar at a well, and God addresses her by name, then asks where she's going and where she came from, and she says, "I'm running away from my mistress." Notice how even though God already knows who Hagar is and has seen her predicament, she's still given the space to explain herself. The Lord's messenger tells her to turn back, go back to your mistress, put up with her harsh treatment of you. But this instruction doesn't come without a promise. "I will give you many children, so many that they can't be counted. You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard about your harsh treatment. He will be a wild mule of a man. He will fight everyone, and they will fight him. He will live at odds with all his relatives." All you moms out there, how would you have liked to hear that when you were pregnant with your firstborn? But we have to remember these promises aren't for just anybody. They're for a marginalized, oppressed slave woman who has been through so much. She tried to make the best of her situation by living into her new role as a wife, but even that is taken away from her, and she's reduced to a surrogate. So God's promise to her that she'll have more descendants than can be counted is greatly significant to her. This promise is a parallel to the one God made to Abram. And through this promise, God is saying, "I know as a slave you are treated as worthless, but I see you as just as valuable and worthy of respect and blessing as the man of the house." This is immediately followed up with a promise about this pregnancy, this baby she's carrying. God is saying, "Hagar, you're not just a surrogate. This baby is going to be your baby and he is going to be a wild mule of a man. Side note, my Bible actually uses a different word for mule that adds a little more punch to this verse, but I won't say it out loud because I know it is the only word my students will hear and they will repeat it. But a feral renegade who throws hands with everyone possible is not who most moms would hope their babies grow up to be. But God creates Ishmael with this kind of spirit out of a profound understanding of who Hagar is and how to bless and comfort her. What Hagar hears in this moment, as a slave with no autonomy, is that her child is going to be free from the cycle. Her son will not be oppressed. He's not going to tolerate the kind of treatment that she's been suffering. He's going to be free, independent, strong enough to fend for himself. And by sharing with Hagar that this is the divine plan for who her son will be, God is also telling her that there is nothing wrong with fighting against oppression. The instruction given to her to return to Sarai isn't a condemnation of her sense of justice or her desire for freedom. It's given as a path she must walk to receive her blessing. Hagar responds, "You are El Roi," which means the God who sees me. Church, so often minorities are not given a voice in what makes us feel blessed. Sometimes we get so caught up in the letter of do unto others as you would have done unto you that we forget to practice the spirit behind it and consider the ways others might be different from ourselves and their needs and values, as well as the experiences that led to them. This past January, Pastor Zach sent me down to Texas to attend Perkins School of Youth and Children's Ministry. All 3 days of the conference, we met at First United Methodist Church Richardson, which was the biggest church I have ever seen in my life. They don't have just one big impressive sanctuary, they have two. A massive cathedral-like space that seats roughly 1,300 people for traditional services, and a modern theater-like space for contemporary services and lectures. Being a crowd of youth and children's directors, we of course met in the contemporary space for worship each day. But before we left, they invited us to tour the rest of the campus, which my new friends from across the Western jurisdiction and I gladly took them up on. When we walked into the main sanctuary, I remember looking up and just saying, whoa. The ceiling was covered in these beautiful exposed beams, which were curved into elaborate arches over these huge chandeliers. The floor was all real tile in this geometric pattern, which led up to a perfectly rounded stage and continued up the steps. Everything about this place looked like it took an incredible amount of skill to build. And 4 out of 5 of us are oohing and awing at it. But my new friend Sanoa, the only black man in our group, says, "It's not my cup of tea." And at first we just kind of silently noted, saying, "Okay, well, you're entitled to your own opinions." But as we continued to look around, he waited a minute and then said it a second time to let us know that he wanted to be heard about something. And knowing that this man is very passionate about history, I stopped and thought about the architecture style from a historical standpoint for just a moment. And then I looked at him and said, "You don't have any cultural heritage that connects you to this kind of thing, do you?" And he nodded his head up and down real big. So Noah wasn't trying to make us feel bad for appreciating the architecture the same way people who experience grief in December aren't trying to ruin Christmas. He just felt left out. And he wanted us to understand that sometimes the things that help us experience sacredness aren't necessarily the same for everyone else, which can make it feel like we don't have room for them. Something that stands out to me about Hagar's response to God is that it captures how even though we all gather to worship the same God, we also experience divinity individually. We know that later in the story, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. But for Hagar, it's actually the other way around. When Hagar calls God El Roi, she becomes the first and only person in the Bible to do a certain thing. She gives God a new name based on her own personal experience. And the meaning is significant because it breaks a major convention set by the other names we've seen for God in Genesis up to this point. El Shaddai, God Almighty. El Elyon, God Most High. Adonai, Lord or Master. All of these display a deep reverence and emphasize God's might as an authority figure who can't be reckoned with. But Hagar trades this emphasis for something much more personable. God who sees me. This oppressed, abused, forced surrogate Egyptian slave woman has the audacity to see God and say, "This is who you are to me." And she isn't shocked about it. She's like, "Did I just see God and survive?" Can you imagine how some people today might react if they heard this coming from a marginalized individual like Hagar? Immigrants, women, people of color, the LGBTQ community. We're all so often told that we have issues with authority. Because what is oppression? It's weaponized authority. And the people wielding it really don't like it when we start to realize that God is not like them. So they start throwing around accusations that we, as well as anyone who dares to stand up for us, have no respect for divine authority. But God doesn't correct Hagar. There's no, excuse me, that's the God Almighty who sees to you. God lets Hagar see El Roi because that is who she needs. Big mountaintop celebrations like Easter allow us to reflect on who God has been through the ages as we carry out the traditions that connect us to our community and our heritage. But down in the valleys, in these quieter, less predictable, maybe even painful moments where we feel so small and powerless, God sees us in ways that perhaps most other people don't. And that validation empowers us. And in turn, we start to experience a shift in how we see God and emulate him as well. I want you to think about two things this week, church. First, what hardships do you carry that you wish others could see? Have you experienced anything that affects your ability to believe that you're worth listening to? And could you benefit from someone listening? And second, what can we do to pay God's love and understanding forward? What do we need to do to lift the veil of our own assumptions so we can see people the way God sees people, so that we can take better care of each other and our community? Remember that you are known, you are loved, and you are seen, and you deserve all of those things.